So, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for session 2 of the day, and I know many of you have been eagerly waiting for this particular session. So, this session is around the book Woman Enough by Kristen Worley. Woman Enough is the account of a human rights battle with global repercussions for the world of sport. It's a challenge to rethink fixed ideas about gender, and it's the extraordinary story of a boy who was rejected for who he wasn't and who fought back until she found out who she is. In his 20s, with the support of newfound friends and family and the medical community, Chris became Kristin. Chris had been a world-class cyclist, and how Kristin wanted to compete for her country and herself in the 2008 Beijing Olympics. She became the first athlete in the world to submit to the International Olympic Committee's gender verification process, the Stockholm Consensus. An all-male jury determined she fit their biological criteria, but the IOC ultimately objected to her use of testosterone supplements, and they and other sports bodies regarded them as performance-enhancing. Ladies and gentlemen, it truly is a privilege for us to welcome Kristen Worley, the author of Women Enough. Today, she's going to talk to us about her book. She's going to talk to us about how she filed a complaint against the sports bodies standing in her way with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, and the fact that she won that. We are truly, truly honored to have her here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to put your hands together for Kristen Worley. And today she's going to be in conversation with Sajeda Momin, who is a senior journalist, spending her last 3 decades working with the Indian media. She started her innings with the Telegraph Calcutta, and she was a part of the launch team of Asian Age in New Delhi, and was also the resident editor of the Asian Age Kolkata edition. She worked as an assistant editor with The Statesman before she moved back home to London as the Europe correspondent of DNA. She is currently an independent journalist writing for a variety of publications and divides her time between London and Kolkata. And I think this is going to be a very, very interesting conversation. We've all been eagerly waiting for it, and I'm going to request both of you to please take over. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you had a riveting time with the last session. We're going to try and keep up the warmth, particularly as it's such a cold morning today. I would like to welcome our wonderful guest, Kristin. She's come all the way from Canada for us. How are you finding the cold, Kristin?
Well, here I am. The irony is here I'm coming from a country where I've had about -6 degrees right now, and we've had 3 major snowstorms in the last month. And look who's wearing the vest. So a bit of irony. So I'm really pleased to be here and to be part of this wonderful festival and meeting all the amazing people over the last day or so that I've been here. I came in on late Friday over a 15-hour flight, so I was feeling a little bit of jet lag yesterday. So I feel I've recovered a little bit more and looking forward to this session and the rest of the day.
Great, great. Well, as you know, I got the book yesterday, and I don't think I've ever read a book in such a short time before. It's a fantastic book. I recommend you all read it. Kristen is a very special lady, as we've been introduced to her. While this is the book writes about, it's a story of her courageous battle against the might of international sports associations. It is also a story about human relationships. And we are very lucky that Kristen has come here to tell us all about it. Without much ado, let's just start with the book, Kristen. You had a very difficult and very complicated childhood. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The book actually is, a lot of people think about me as a cyclist, and which I have the background, which is kind of the underlying part of my story throughout my life, where sport played various different roles to where I am today. And for me, the unique part of my beginning of my life, I actually didn't start off living in Canada. I was actually born of a New Zealand mother. I was conceived in New Zealand, and then my mom immigrated to Canada 6 months pregnant with me and had me born and adopted in Canada. So just recently, actually, I was just down in New Zealand this past summer visiting with my family, and I was actually able to get my New Zealand citizenship. And I kind of wanted to reflect too, just really quickly, my cricket connection, because obviously the conversation being here is all around cricket. So I've been learning a lot about it. I happened to watch the World Championships with my uncle down in Dunedin with New Zealand competing against England back in July. So I'm learning all the ins and outs of cricket for the first time, and so it's been a big learning curve for me.
Fantastic,
so, yeah.
fantastic. Yeah, you were adopted by a family in Canada. Your childhood in that sense was very difficult with that adopted family. Would you like to give us a bit of detail on that?
In my growing up in Canada, Canada is a very much, I was adopted into a family that's kind of a middle class kind of Canadian family. And what I kind of call is called the triangle, or what I call in the book is called the platinum triangle. I grew up in a Canadian sporting family. Many Canadian families that were involved in summer and winter sports activities. We all kind of, across the country, were united through various sports, one being hockey, one being snow skiing, and a variety of other sports. And for me, in our family, sport became a big part of kind of the underpinning of how we got along as a family and how we communicated. But the unique part of my journey was regards to, I was struggling as a young person at the ages of 2 and 3, 4 years of age with issues of gender and gender confusion as a young person. And so it was a very difficult time for me, living in a very conservative family, not being able to get the support or the acknowledgement what it meant to be living with this type of diversity and getting the necessary help. So I was struggling as a young person from a very young age right through into my teenage years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, when reading through the first half of the book, which you've sort of divided very nicely into, the first half is your autobiography, your early days, and then the second half is the transition, your transition, and then it deals with your sporting issues. So when you read through that first half, you really feel quite sorry for this young boy, Chris Jackson, who is going through all these difficulties with parents who are totally oblivious to what he's going through.
Right.
Did you at any point sort of attempt to speak to them about the psychological dimension of what was happening to you?
Well, at that time,
yes.
I'm obviously now a retired athlete and a retired international cyclist, and so I'm kind of reaching my middle age. I won't give you the actual number, but at that time, we didn't talk. Even in Canada, we hadn't progressed as a nation to be able to talk about diversity, let alone the issues around sexuality or gender, wasn't commonly discussed. So. For me, though I lived in a middle-class type of family and had opportunity to participate in sport and education and all those other things, as a young person, I couldn't have been more alone because there was no language around any of these things. And so for me, I struggled with it because not knowing why this was happening and why these things were occurring and why things I had to identify to kind of balance out the differences in the two genders of which I was living as a young person. And this was happening at 3 and 4 or 5 years of age. So it wasn't something that I made up as an adult. It was something that I was living with and trying to oppress because I was afraid that I was letting down my family. And I didn't know why these things were happening. And it was confusing. Through my trajectory through adolescence through into my teenage years, I actually tried to commit suicide 3 times.
Yeah.
And a lot of that had to do because I felt that I was failing my family.
Right.
And I just felt that I was a bad person. And actually acknowledging later on in life, as I went through my transition, that as the professional support that I received eventually, that this is who I was. And unfortunately, our society, or living in Canada at the time, we just didn't know enough about it. So there's a lot of challenges for young people who are living with these issues, not just in Canada, but around the world. It's not unique just to my experience or in Canada, in that the limitations of our abilities to acknowledge these differences of our diversity, when it as it relates to sexuality and gender.
Right. You keep talking in the book about a switch in your mind, that you get a switch and your mind sort of relates in different ways. Could you explain a little bit about what that switch is all about?
Absolutely. So as you and I, as everybody in the hall today, we all, as we know when we are born, when our mom and dad see the birth of their child for the first time, we base the identity of that child based on the sex of their body. And so as a young person at that time, as an infant, at birth, my parents immediately assimilated. In my case, I was adopted, so came into their, as my birth mother had born me. My parents knew they were having a boy at that time.
Right.
And so for them, that you immediately go into that trajectory. And obviously it's the same thing for females, go into another trajectory based on the sex of the child. But in some cases, what happens, as we know biologically now, is that sometimes that between the sex and the gender of a person during the development of the infant, before the child is born, sometimes the two can split. So what actually physically happens is the body keeps going in one trajectory and the brain goes into the other trajectory. So there's actually a very physical, biological difference between the brain sex and the body gender.
Right.
Sorry, the brain gender and the body sex. So for me, the switch that you're talking about, again, when I was a young child, I didn't understand why I was doing the things I was doing, and the behavior sense of more towards my sister's interests and the things that I was interested that way, is that the switch is because I was being socialized day to day because of my appearance of being a young boy at that time, that everything around me in terms of media, conversations with parents, school teachers, and so on, you're socialized in that trajectory. But what is happening is that my brain gender was the opposite.
Yeah.
So what the switch is that my body was fighting what my environment was telling it. So as I got older, it became more and more progressive. And so that's why you feel this kind of anxieties. This is why you feel these tendencies of which I did as a young adult, the feelings of suicide, because you just want to get off this roller coaster. But the problem is that you don't really understand why it's happening, but at the same time, that you have nobody to talk about or express what is occurring.
Right.
Because you think this is, you're kind of going, you think, well, am I crazy? Like you don't understand within yourself because you can't explain it. Because it's not part of your normal environment to which you were being brought up into. And for me, in my case, was a very conservative environment. So I had no place to go to.
Do you think that if you had been adopted by a family which was a little bit more loving, a little bit more understanding, would your journey have been easier to progress into transition?
Great question. I know now, having met my birth family in New Zealand, they're obviously I have a small farm family in the south island of New Zealand. My mom said to me, my birth mom said to me, we would have never known what to have done with that, been able to meet. So theoretically, in terms of the socialization in Canada around these issues, I was fortunate to be living in Canada. And I think in the terms of where I then inevitably ended up in my future family, Worley, shows that exactly answers that question. If it was a more progressive family, more loving family, more interactive family, certainly that would have been the case. But if I could just wanted to kind of back up on one thing is in terms of my adoptive family and growing up, that sport connection was essential in terms of how our family communicated. My father was a world champion sailor, and it was a very driven environment. So this is how we communicated as a family. And for me as well, growing up as a small child, I was bullied through my early school years, and I didn't know why. I was a very creative individual, but I was always bullied. But it was interesting, when in Canada we have a school system where you go to school from grade 1 to grade 6, and then you go to a middle school from grade 7 to grade 8, and then high school from grade 9 to grade 13. So it was an interesting transition time for me from the ages from grade school from grade 6 to grade 7, because at one point, sport didn't really come easily to me. So what I did, there was a program in Canada called the Award of Excellence by Participation, and it was a program that helped to look at the health of young people in the country. It was a measurement in public school. And they had Award of Excellence, gold, silver, and bronze. I was the kid who got the ribbon that said, "Thanks for coming out." And but there was a transition in my physiology as a young person where by the time I went to middle school at grade 7, I learned that I knew how to run.
Right.
And I could learn how to run fast. And all of a sudden a switch went on for my local friends, that all of a sudden I realized my sport, that was a trajectory where all of a sudden it created an identity for me separate of where I was before, and the bullying stopped. And so everybody recognized me for my ability as an athlete. So this is kind of where my sport trajectory started to take off for me, because actually I never wanted to get into elite sport. Elite sport came to me through a progression of entering into sport. This is a method to protect myself, protect myself from what was going on. Right?
Yeah. You know, on a broader level, there is a growing trend in the West where parents do not assign a gender to their newborn child. So it's a question of they bring them up gender neutral.
Right.
It's not a he or a she.
Right.
And you have, they're called Z.
Right.
And but they want the child, once the child grows up, to be able to choose their own gender.
Right.
Whether they know whether they're a boy or a girl. Do you think that's a good idea?
It's a great question. I can't say there's a right or wrong answer yet to that kind of ideal of that as a potential trajectory in our society. What I can tell you, because for me, when I went through my transition, I think this is really, really important, is that I did it I started in my late 20s and early 30s is where it was my trajectory. But I realized as a young person, if I was able to have transitioned when I was 9, 10, 12, 13, 14 years of age, my life would have been entirely different in terms of my socialization, my education, my sporting trajectory. All these other things would have changed drastically for me because the gender dysphoria, or the difference in the gender, was so disruptive. Living through this for so long, it actually delayed my development in terms of my social side and even my professional side in terms of my sporting career, let alone my design career that I'm in currently now. So I believe, and which is going on, there's a lot of work going on by a very dear colleague of mine by the name of Dr. Dick Schwab in Denmark, which is the leading gender research study group in the world, and I visited it 2 years ago. And they're now helping young people to slow down the progression of their gender transition at ages 9, 10, and 11, and allowing them to live within that new gender without going through transition. So it's helping them to, instead of having to go through the retransition over again and kind of re-identify yourself, which takes several years, you're only doing it once.
Could you just elaborate a little bit for the audience about what you actually mean by transition in sort of simple language? And also, just tell us, when exactly did you feel, at what age did you think that it's enough, I've had enough of being a boy or living in a boy's body?
Both interesting questions. In terms of transition, what the idea is what we were talking about earlier, is that switch that goes on and off, and it's very disruptive to an individual living in that. It's very biological. It's hardwired into who you are. So basically, what the transition does is helps you to kind of get off that roller coaster, and it's a very real. Once you go through the transition, that switch stops. It absolutely stops. All that disruption goes away. So there's a real science to it, and what the idea is behind it is to be able to align the physical sex of the body to that of the brain gender. So what you do is you go through a hormonal change, depending on what trajectory you're going on, which is either if you're going from the male sex to the female sex, or the female sex to the male sex. So the specific hormone changes, either being testosterone or estrogen, depending on the trajectory that you're on, they elevate that level of that hormone and decrease in the other hormone of that particular sex. And then inevitably, which in my case took 5.5 years to go through just that part of it alone, to which then I went through a surgical intervention in my body to change the sex of my body.
How long did that surgical intervention take? And it must have been quite grueling.
It's terrifying. And that's what I think what's really important for a lot of people, because I think a lot of people, especially when we talk about it in the sports context, there has always been an assumption in Olympic sport, even under Olympic policy, to which I work in that sphere with the IOC and the Commonwealth Games Federation and so on. There's always been that historical context that somebody's going to change their body to participate as the opposite sex in a given sport. And you're actually basically setting yourself up for suicide, because it's something that you don't take lightly to go through, because it's a life change that has serious implications to it in terms of your well-being, in terms of your psychological well-being, let alone your physical health. It's quite a complex, woven relationship. So it's something that you don't take very lightly.
Well, you were telling me earlier that you were absolutely terrified. It's probably the worst moment in your life when you were going in for surgery.
That's right. I was with my then Worley family, and I can tell you at that moment, before in that moment before going into the OR at that time, there's a special, in Canada we have a special institution in Montreal that they specialize in this. And thank God that we have it, because people come from all over the world to it for help. It's one of the top in the world, and at that particular moment, you're making decisions that implicate so many different aspects of your life in terms of your mental health, your sexual health, your relationship, and many other aspects of your life in that particular moment. And so, yes, it's absolutely terrifying. It's probably the biggest decision I've ever made in my life.
In the 80s and 90s, there was this idea that when you feel that you're in the wrong body, the wrong sex body, that's not really a physical, scientific thing. It's a psychological thing. And, change your clothes and get on with it. And,
right.
Wear women's clothes and you'll be fine. Did you ever come to that sort of, be affected in any way by people trying to tell you that?
There's an organization in Canada, in Toronto specifically, called at that time it was the Clark Institute, and it's a psychiatric institute. It was an international psychiatric institute that specialized in this. And then it changed its name to the Center of Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. And that's actually how they treated it back in those days. And at that time, they actually, even years before that, they used to give the individual electric shock treatment to their brain to help virtually numb the neurological system of the brain to get them to stop thinking that way. But it's buried in your DNA. You're hardwired. So I mean, that was just 30 years ago. So the evolution that we've gotten through, here we are in 2019, we're managing these things in a very different way and really understanding the differences and the variations that everybody in the room here shares, actually. It's not unique to specific people who are dealing with gender transition to get to that point. But if you look across the room, and we talk about it in a sporting context, you look at the body variations of each one of us, male and female. We are all unique in a variety of different ways. So we're looking at the sporting context and engagement in sport in different levels of elite sport. When we talk about male and female in that kind of vertical trajectory, as what I call the elevator, it's really not that one vertical. It's actually multiple verticals, and they actually kind of cross that several lines together, to which we are all unique. And I think that's a trajectory that I'm on, working with the IOC and International Olympic Committee and international sport and governance around the world, is helping to kind of start to acknowledge that and kind of build out that discussion to understand some of the top athletes in the world, and including Indian athletes and so on. Those unique qualities of those specific individuals make them specifically the best in the world. That's why they are there, is because they have very specific, unique gifts that they've been born with, unique to anybody else, which makes them the best. So it's a conversation that we need to kind of broaden out, and these discussions around gender, very much as we had Duty sitting here yesterday, and the experiences that she and I shared, because during my cycling career, I was the first athlete in the world to be gender tested, where I was violated by 8 men sexually and psychologically through the policy of the Olympic movement back in the 2003, 2004 when it first came out. I was the first athlete, let alone in the sport of cycling.
Could you just elaborate a little bit about that gender testing, gender verification test that you went through?
Sure, and as it relates to the book as well, I put it actually in the very prologue of the book because I think it's really important because I think it also, when we're talking about duty and many of the other Indian athletes that I've come to know over the last 17, 18 years, one being Sajeda, who is a wonderful 800-meter runner, silver medalist at the Asian Games, and also Pinky as well, who I've come to know. And there's actually several other South Asian women that I've come to know, and also a good friend of mine, Caster Semenya, who was violated back in 2009, and everybody knows that story over the last 10 years. So, and how we mismanaged these issues on gender and sexuality in the sporting system. And so really what it comes down to is policy that has been designed by the Olympic movement. And like Canada, India is in the same position under the hospice of the 206 nations when it comes to the alignments to the Olympic Games and the Olympic movement specifically. But just so everybody knows, is that the Olympic Games was designed. The modern Olympic Games Olympiad was designed by a gentleman by the name of Coubertin back in 1896, and it was designed by men for men to entertain men, right? So that's very common. I actually was in discussions with the IOC about that a couple weeks ago, so we kind of laugh about it, but that's the reality of it. So it was his vision of sport back in 1896, and it is typically done on a European conservative vision. So look where we are, it's moved tenfold. You know, in terms of the vast cultural diversities and language diversities and other human diversities that we have with the combination of the 206 nations under the Olympic movement. There is such a vastness to which originally Coubertin had designed the modern games. And so the issue is that the policy to which was designed for sport was based on one specific pillar, vertical pillar of male and female sport. Right. And so even up to 20 years ago, when the policy that I was gender tested under, and many of the other women that the people here in India have come to know of their own athletes, is that it's based on a very narrow trajectory of how we had to understand the male sex and female sex, let alone human performance, and how they are woven together. It's very complicated. And the problem is that they tried to make it very systematically, very simple. And what's happening is it's basically like putting a square peg into a round hole, and it's splintering all around it. And unfortunately, it's the athletes that are paying the cost for it. And as you heard Duty talking yesterday, I remember 15 years ago having the very same conversation with Sajeda in terms of her trajectory as an amazing athlete at the same level as Duty was. 15 years ago, and the lack of support because of the lack of knowledge around these issues, and the limitations to where she sits now in her life and career as one of the top athletes at that time in Indian athletics for India.
You know, you said about the IOC having an issue with you and the gender verification test that you did. They were very insensitive to you, and you felt violated. Being violated here has a slightly different connotation. So if you could just explain exactly what the test involved.
Sure.
But not...
Yeah, I'm very careful because I don't have to give details because I actually have a bit of what we call PTSD from it. So I actually relive the power of the experience. But for me, I was put into an environment where I was basically told by the sporting community under the policy and the hospice of the IOC, where this was enacted on top of me by World Cycling, UCI, Union Cycling International, and in Canada through my sporting trajectory there in Ottawa, where I was gender tested sexually and psychologically by a team of 8 men, and in which they wrote a report. And they basically said to me, there was no female intervention. There was nobody that intervened to give me the support. I was basically there on my own. And it's basically the feeling was that they were empowered by the policy that was handed down by the IOC to be able, that they felt they could do this. One, they felt they had a right to do this, and the other part was that they felt that I deserved it. And somehow I was a problem for sport, and they wanted to teach me a lesson. So like in other words, Kristen, if you want to compete, as they said, it's our way or the highway, knowing absolutely nothing. And I can now, what we now know, because I went through the legal piece with the IOC, is there is no science or research to any of these policies over the last 20 years on gender verification. So what's happening is this policy's coming in, and through the Olympic movement and governments around the world, include under the Olympic Agreement, where these countries, India, Canada, and other nations have done the same thing, are enacting these policies, and basically it's a free-for-all. And the athletes, they're doing this based on what they want to do. And as anybody in the room knows, when you go to your doctor, you go to a doctor with very specific privacies and and protections and all those other things, and it's a very private relationship.
Yes.
But now you've got sports people enacting these actions who have no experience whatsoever and actually don't even know what they're doing.
And it's done in a very crude manner.
It's done in a very crude manner. So athletes like myself, what happened to Duty, what happened to Caster Semenya, and many other athletes were done in this particular manner. And the other thing is really important to understand as well is to understand that we're asking athletes to change their bodies for a period of 4 to 8 to 10 years on a given sport trajectory that impacts their sexual health, their psychological health, their physical health for the rest of their lives. And what I actually compare it to kick a ball, to run around a track, to ride a bike, or to swing a cricket bat, and that's what you're asking somebody to do, to fit a social structure rather than a sporting trajectory that actually fits the biologies of our society. And was what I was kind of coming back to when I was talking about Kubertin, the advancements of where we are today in terms of our social society developments as women and men in society, that the sporting system hasn't caught up and redesigned the sporting system to fit the vast diversities, the immense diversities that we are all engaged in, that kind of fits as a much better fit to our society today.
Do you think the IOC is any more sensitive now than it was all those years ago when you had the test done?
I can tell you, with the limitations that I can tell you at this point, the book has had tremendous impact. And because I went through a legal case with the IOC 3 years ago, and I think that's what's really important out of this, is that I lost my health because my body didn't have the means to be able to, because I had lost all the hormones in my body. And because the science and the research hadn't been done on any of this, it impacted the trajectory of my career and where I became unwell, which I couldn't sustain my athletic performance on the bike. So what I decided to do, and I was fortunate to come back to the adoption piece, that I was adopted in Canada because we're one of 2 legal systems in the world that has a human rights policy structure that enabled me to go outside of the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland to be able to seek civil litigation against international sport, to which we were successful.
So would you say that, could you explain to them a little bit more about the problem that you had with the IOC and the case that you had with the IOC?
Sure. Well, the issue was, what I was stating earlier, is there was no science or research to the policies. So I knew this back in 2007, 2008. And so there was a the head of the medical commission at the time was a gentleman by the name of Arne Blinkvist from Sweden. And because I knew, I'd connected with some of the top researchers in the world about these issues and about what was going on with my health, is that when it's basically I was talking to the power. And so what happened is that the resistance came back and saying, like, Kristen, you know too much.
Because you had done a lot of research about
and it was acknowledging the fact that the IOC and World Cycling and my cycling community and the Canadian government at the time in Canada, and also the World Anti-Doping Agency, were kind of going, oh my gosh, she knows more than we do. And it was threatening to them because it was an acknowledgement to the world that they're putting out policy through the Olympic movement that was being enacted on by countries, Canada, India, South Africa, and other nations around the world, without any science and research to it. So it was more of a commercial impact and concern that the institutional problem. And so there was all this pushback at me. So what I had to do, instead of going to the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland, where duty and Castor has had problems because it's owned and run by sport, I was successful to take it into a civil litigation position outside of the sport community, which brought the IOC and international sport into a civil litigation in Toronto, outside of the sport system, to which they had to respond to. In a place that they couldn't control. So that was really important because then they had to provide the science and the research to the policies, which they couldn't do.
Right. Do you think the ban on Castor is justified?
I've known Castor for 11 years. I was involved with her case back in 2009. I met.
Do you want to just briefly talk a little bit about the case so that
Yeah.
in case anybody who doesn't know?
Sure. I was back in 2009. Yeah, back in 2009, when Castor was questioned of her gender identity or sexual identity at the World Championships in Berlin, I remember the following day after the event, a gentleman by the name of Greg Knott called me from South Africa. I didn't know Greg. He was a lawyer. He'd worked with Oscar Piatoris at the time on the carbon fiber technology, to which now we have in the Paralympic and Olympic Games and changing policy on Paralympic technology, which is promoting active sport. Greg called me out of the blue and he goes, "Kristen, I know this is bad." He goes, "I need you to tell me why this is bad." So I worked with Greg and with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Tim Noakes in South Africa for 11 months to help Castor that following July get back in competing in world athletics behind the scenes. But unfortunately, it came back again and over the last 10 years. And then obviously, Duty's case got engaged in it as well. And it became an issue where the sporting system's trying to identify the difference, again, trying to find this vertical pillar between the sexes based on testosterone. And it's an inaccurate science, and neither side actually has done it correctly. And I think also, in particular, Duty's trajectory and tremendous support to her is that unfortunately I think there's some misinformation in terms of her own entourage and her support that she's getting. Because we were successful in Toronto based on the science and the research, and we know what the issues are. And unfortunately, Duty's entourage support network that she had, and also with Castor, they went back to the Court of Arbitration. And unfortunately, it's what we call sport court. And it's highly manipulated because it's owned and run by sport, and it's not a separate, independent legal process. And so it's very precarious in terms of results and the way the legal process is done in the Court of Arbitration, into which it's kind of left everybody kind of in limbo and now waiting for the Swiss tribunal to kind of come up with an answer in the next few months.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I think we've overstepped our mark time-wise, so can I just throw it open to the floor?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions here.
There's a lot of questions, so I've got a lot, but they've got a lot. So yes, can we have the questions, please? Yes, there's a gentleman right here.
There's a whole bunch of people
Okay,
at your
yeah.
podcast.
I'll give him the mic.
Sorry, I'll get to you in a minute. Can we just have the lady there first?
Hi, Kristen. My name is Radhika. So
Hi, Radhika.
my question is, you talked about Duti Chand and you listened to her yesterday, right?
Right.
So, do you think that IAAF will stop Duti from playing?
We'll stop Duty from running.
Yeah, from running.
What I can tell you, because I'm in other discussions, I can't say publicly right now, but I know in terms of Duty's running, I perceive they won't stop her from running. I mean, I think she's in a pretty safe place. What I would like to be able to see for Duty is to see potentially for a lot more, in which I'm working on, which I can say with the International Olympic Committee, independently of the IAF, and looking at bigger opportunities of education and support for National Olympic Committees and athletics groups, and also, in other sports as well, but to help advance the knowledge. So it's not sitting in one organization to make the decisions. And this is kind of what I was kind of getting at, is that when I went outside of the sports system, I was able to get results. When you're working within the system, and it was actually very interesting hearing the first group this morning talking about the kind of the interrelationships. And when you're working in kind of that minefield, there's a lot of politics that go on and a lot of, dare I say it, self-serving in some cases. And so that's why it was important for me to kind of go outside the system to then re-inject it back into the system to say, this is the result. And that's what I've been able to publish very clearly in the book. And it's now causing which is a wonderful thing to see, is my colleagues at the International Olympic Committee taking it to heart and saying, we got to change.
One more question. You also talked about PTSD. Most athletes these days suffer from that if they are having an internal injury or they are not scoring good, in cricket, like they are not scoring runs.
Yeah.
Or like in athletics, they are not, they are not marking the point. They are not getting up to date. They are not, basically achieving the basic need, what they actually want to achieve. So PTSD is basically from trauma. So they have mental trauma.
Yeah.
So I would like to know that what is your take on that and how they should deal with PTSD?
Oh my goodness. we were talking
Sorry,
about this.
I know it's very personal question.
Me and I was talking to him, I mean, that's why I was so grateful to Monty talking about this yesterday. It's a big crisis in Olympic sport, and obviously cricket's a big independent game, independent of the Olympics, and much bigger, and as is world football and so on. It's a challenging discussion for athletes. And it's very critical. I was actually part of an event the last couple of years down in Sydney called Crossing the Line, where Olympic athletes were getting together, men and women, and Paralympians as well, and talking about the mental health impacts that they were struggling with as athletes, because there's been a high level of, particularly of suicides in Australian sport, Olympic level elite athletes, in dealing with the issues of mental health, because we're not talking about it. So the issues around, if we use the ideas of gender, so if you're talking about my experience or Judy's experience or Castor's experience, I can tell you the irony is the Indian media has been so supportive to me over the last 15 years. I can tell you it's probably the biggest media group that's been more supportive than any other media group in the world. Back in the day when I was going through my challenges, you basically felt like you were a chameleon, because people felt that the media felt they could go into your life and publish anything about you internationally. And so when you're looking at Judy, who was here yesterday, or you're looking at Castor, which is a tremendous challenge, where they're going out to international events and preparing for an international events. You can't hide from the level of social media that's out there, that's always carrying your name every single day, over and over and over and over again, and you can't escape that, because that mental impact to you, and where people are trying to get right down to the very basic of your human identity, and how can you be a great athlete and focus on your training when people are dealing with your basic identity as a human being, let alone your physical sex, and talking it in a global environment. It's horrifying. And so when you see Judy sitting up here yesterday, incredible courage. She's more than just a sportswoman, an potential Olympic athlete, It's way more than just that, right? Her courage is outstanding. And here to be able to talk about it is even more so, right? So having lived it first person and having gone through that, it takes years to get through that. It took me, I retired several years ago, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. But yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yes, sir.
Good morning to you all.
The mic's not working. Just.
Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning to you all. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Chandran. I worked for Sports Authority of India in the past. I have come across this gender problem for 3 decades. I haven't found a solution for that. I'm glad that Kristin is here to answer a couple of.
Very well.
I'm glad that
A little
you're
bit
here.
louder, sir. Just a little louder.
I'm glad that Kristin is here today and to satisfy my questions. Answers my questions I want to find from you.
Sorry, could you repeat the last thing?
I can't.
Yeah, she can't.
I look forward to get answers to my questions from Kristin.
Yes, please. Could you ask the question?
My number one question is that you underwent reassignment surgery, right?
You underwent reassignment surgery, he's saying.
Yes, correct. That's correct.
what's the chromosomal pattern you carry? You do have a Y chromosome in you.
Do you have what's the chromosome pattern you have?
I'm an XY chromosome, just like you.
So when you have got Y chromosome, do you think you get an advantage over other female athletes?
Sorry, say
Do
that
they
again.
get advantage over the other female
Did you,
athletes?
because you have a Y chromosome? do
No,
you have-
because as you know, as a physician, my primary hormone, just like you is testosterone. So the issue is that my body becomes heavily contraindicated because my body having going through a physical transition and losing the gonads to support that development of the hormone. The issue is the body can't, if you're familiar with the term hypogonadism, because you're XY chromosome, that you go into an extreme level of that hypergonadic state because I have 0.4 levels of percent of testosterone as an XY chromosome person. So you're actually comparing, when you're talking about a female with XY chromosomes to a female with XX chromosomes, you're actually physically, you're comparing apples to oranges. Because as you well know, as an XY, the primary hormone for somebody who's XY chromosomes, separate of the sex of the body, is testosterone. And then for somebody who's XX chromosome, is because of reproduction, is based on estrogen and human growth hormone, with a small level of testosterone. So you're comparing we are socialized in this discussion, talking about male and female before we're actually talking about the physical sciences. And so what we learned through me and several other athletes who've been through transition from a gonadal standpoint is that what we've learned is that the body can't sustain itself over 10 years. So eventually what happens is the other female athletes who have the hormonal support, when they train, they go like this. And what happens with transition athletes, they go like this because they can no longer sustain their physiology because they don't have the hormonal support to drive it.
Number 2 question. When you have got Y chromosome, you undergone reassignment surgery on what basis? What was the need for you to undergo reassignment surgery? Why you were disqualified from participation?
He's saying that what was the need for you to go in for reassignment surgery and what was the basis for you to be disqualified? He said if you already had a Y chromosome, what was the need for you to go in for realignment surgery, reassignment surgery?
That's because the brain gender, which is my hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus gland, which drives everybody's gender, is that for me, the issue was I was going between the sexes because for me, my hypothalamus gland was identifying as female at a physiological level, but my physical sex was male in terms of my sex. So the issue is what was happening as a young person. The switch which we were talking about in the book, I would 5 to 6 times a day be cross-gendering. It was very disruptive in my life. And as I got older and went through puberty, it became even more progressive because I was living between the two worlds at a biological level. So with the sex reassignment surgery and the hormonal changes, that evolution, you're living in two worlds, brings it together like this. So when I went through that gender transition, after about 1.5 years after my recovery, it all went away. I never think about it.
My last question is, you know that Olympics only 2 gender categories, male and female. We all know that. And that being the situation, how does the other genders fit in Olympics? I feel that the third gender, if there's a third gender, they should go into Paralympics because Paralympics is meant for differently abled athletes. So do you suggest that they can be grouped into Paralympic Games, the third gender?
No.
Yeah. Did you understand
I'm
the
asking
question?
your opinion. I'm asking your opinion.
Kristen, did you understand the question?
Just want me to answer the
Okay.
question. No, I don't think we can answer that question.
Yeah.
No.
It's
disruptive.
You don't want to.
Yeah.
answer.
No, that's not.
She doesn't want to answer the question.
That's not a good question.
And we respect that. Are there any other questions in the house? Yes, please.
At
Go
the
ahead.
back there.
Ask away.
Hi, Kristen. This is Kritika. My question to you is: when you were Chris Jackson,
Yeah.
when you were a boy, actually, you identified yourself as a woman, but for the society, you were a boy. So you told the globalandmail.com in an interview that you were really you felt like you were anorexic, you were depressed, you started smoking pot. So how did you started smoking pot? You started hanging out with the
Yeah.
older people.
Yeah.
So how did you came out of that? And also, you've been married for 17 years now, I
Yeah.
guess.
No,
right?
I was married for 17 years.
You were married for 17
Yeah.
years, and in those 17 years, for 7 years, you went for the sex reassignment surgery, right?
That's right.
So how did your girlfriend, like your ex, how did she supported you? And
Well,
like,
two great questions, and thank you for asking. The first question, it kind of was what we were talking about earlier, is that in my preteen development age, I was in that terms of that isolation that I was talking about.
Right.
I went to alcohol and pot, marijuana, as a way to resolve my anxieties, because there was a point in my at 12 and 13 and 14 years of age. So I was in a really difficult place in which at one point I tried to commit suicide because of the anxiety that I was having at that time. So sport played a big part of that for me, to actually where I got into endurance sport, because at that age I had actually gone on to competing internationally in the sport of water skiing before I took on the sport of cycling. So for me, it was a way out, and I found sport as at one point was my protector when I first started amongst my friends and community. But sport then became a way of me managing the anxieties. And actually, when I was in grade 10 and I was in high school, I actually became anorexic because I was trying to manage the anxieties and I was overtraining just to deal with the body image issues that I was having. So, and again, this is back in the 70s and the mid 80s. So back then we didn't talk about these things. So I was going through this journey completely alone. And so, so we've evolved so much in a lot of countries now, to where a lot of young people aren't experiencing what me and many other pioneers have experienced, and so on. So, and by the way, I thank you for that question.
I also have another question.
Let me just answer the one about my partner. I was married for 17 years.
Yeah.
And I went through my transition with my partner, Allison, and under the name Worley. And so, and what's happened, in the last 10 years actually of my life, Allison helped me through my trajectory and is now my little sister. So we as a family, under the family Worley, I have my sister-in-law and my then partner are now my sisters. So.
Can we,
Hi.
any more?
Yeah.
Hi, Kirsten. Hi.
Hi.
My name's Toshan. Kirsten, sport and sports people have always been a source of inspiration, especially for the youth. With the suicide rates and the attempted suicide rates amongst the trans community, how do you feel that having a role model like you and other trans athletes can actually kind of help them get over that kind of difficult part of their life? And
it's a big question, and and also that's a great question, and there's not one easy answer for that. I think having us as role models is important, and it's interesting that you in terms of that, because when I was in my teens, I had no role model. I didn't know what that looked like. Actually, the way I came to know it was there was a James Bond movie. I don't know if many of you recall. It was called The Spy Who Loved Me, and it was, I remember it very well, the film, because the actress who was playing beside Roger Moore at the time was actually a Canadian woman who lives in the States, and she was in the British media. It came out 6 months later that she had been through transition. And when I learned that story, knowing what had been going on in my life for the last 15 years or so to that point, and I looked at it and I kind of went, is that what's going on in my life? And I said, that's just crazy. I always went, that can't be happening to me, right? Because I lived in a very conservative environment. We didn't have language around this. And I was just kind of going, it was too foreign to me, right? And so I think what you're getting at, and I think where a lot of this discussion is going, and I think what's really important is being in environments like this, where we can have very authentic conversations, and it's happening, where, and this is what's happening in sport, and what I'm trying to actually do is get past the LGBTQ acronym, because as soon as you apply that box, you're all of a sudden excluding people from the conversation. So what I'm trying to do is to find ways of bringing people into the conversation who aren't LGBTQ, but may have another diversity, or areas around accessibility, other cultural differences, right? I always have this value system where I think to myself, we have a lot more in common than we do difference. So once we actually start thinking that way, and thinking that in many ways we may have different diversity types going on in our personal lives, but there's a lot of commonality and reasons why we get to certain points in our life. And get there for the same reasons. So once you find those senses of commonality, you're bringing a lot more people to the table. And this is what I've been doing, and finding that common language to get the more conservative bodies at the Internationals of Sport. And now I've been successful with Commonwealth and also with the IOC to bring them to the table, to where we're now having these conversations, to where they now feel comfortable about going forward with it as well. So yeah, it's a really big problem, but I think the big answer is finding that commonality and making more people come to the table and not excluding people.
Any more? Is that it?
I think that's it.
That's it.
Thank you so much, Kristen. You've made some very powerful points, just like your book. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a huge round of applause for Kristen Worley?
Thank you.
And
I think we're going to launch the book here.
yes, let's launch the book. So she's
It's a
officially...
fantastic book, and I recommend that all of you buy it and read it. It's a wonderful read. It's a very honest depiction of your journey from where you were and where you are today. It's a fantastic book. Please.
Thank you.
Please step forward. Let's have
Thank you,
pictures,
everyone.
and let's
Thank you.
have
Thank
a
you.
bigger round of applause, everybody. This is truly, truly special. So we officially launched the book in India. Women Enough, How a Boy Become a Woman and Change the World of Sport. Thank you very much once again for sharing that magnificent story with all of us.